So what I want to talk about is the biological control of acacias, but what I'm going to be saying could apply to any of the other weeds that are being used or targeted with biological control. So it's a generic sort of story, but using acacias as the example. And my perception is that there's a lot of confusion out there as what we should be expecting of biological control, and that's leading to these sort of statements. And you can go on this website. I don't know who Jeremy Kudes is. Does anybody know him? Anyway, this is what he's put on a website. And clearly he thinks that biological control of Acacia saligna using a rust fungus is not working. In fact, he goes as far as to say that it was a waste of time and money, I believe. There's still plenty of seeding, the plants are surviving, and he's quite confident that he can make this statement because he doesn't think anything's happened. I think he might change his mind if he actually did some investigation and a little bit of research into what he's trying to say. By looking at some of the literature that's available, which shows quite to the contrary, that in fact uromacladium is having a huge impact on Acacia saligna. And I think it's rather like climbing up a mountain. I can use it as a simile. You set out to climb a mountain and you get some way up, and you reach it, you come to a precipice which is absolutely insurpassable. And there's two things you can do. You can look ahead and say, well, we're never going to get to the top. Sorry, that's in my pocket. We're never going to get to the top, so we fail. And you'll always be disappointed if you're looking ahead. Alternatively, you can look, you say, we're not going to get to the top, but look behind you and say, look how far we've come, look what we've achieved. And then you're always going to be pleased. You've actually done something. And then you can sit and sip your beer in the evening and be happy. So looking forward is going to be doom and gloom. Looking back is going to be happiness. And I want to use the acacias just to show looking backwards is quite an enlightening exercise. So, if we look at the Acacia program, it's been going for a long time. The first stage was released in 1982, 30 years ago. It tackles the acacias as a suite of weeds, and that's a good thing to do because if you get rid of one, it's quite likely another will move into the void that's been created. So it's a good thing to treat them as a single entity and tackle them all together. And as a result of that, we've introduced a lot of agents over this long period of time, and every acacia on this list has at least one biological control agent on it. Interestingly, and I think not surprisingly, there's only one, and again it's the rust fungus, and I've left that in black, because that is the only one that attacks the whole plant and destroys the trees completely. All the rest of these, the reds, the greens, and the blues, are insects that attack either the flower buds, the flowers, or the seeds. And the primary objective with these is just to reduce the seeding levels of the plants. And that's because lots of people are making lots of money out of acacias. Pulp, charcoal, furniture, firewood. And we have to respect that people want to use it, but if we can make it less invasive by using our seed insects, then we should do so. And what I want to do today is to take three of these species, Cyclops, longifolia, and Mercia, and just look at them in a little more detail to show you what I mean by looking backwards is a far more desirable way to go. Now I'm using longifolia because it's been going for a long time. I'm using Cyclops because we've been doing a lot of work on Cyclops. And I'm using Mercia because Mercia is lots of exciting things happening for them. So if we look at Acacia longifolia, longleaf wattle, how many people can remember this sort of vista in the Western Cape? Yeah, David. But there's not a lot of people who remember that if you drove around the Western Cape in the middle of the last century, maybe because you went around in the middle of the last century, this was a very common sight. Whole hillsides covered with Acacia longifolia. And that's why people rank Acacia longifolia as usually as in the top 3 weeds in the country, and people were very concerned about this as a problem invasive species. Okay. And that justified introducing the gall wasp, Trichilogaster, here's a little female, which lays its eggs in the flower buds and induces the galls to develop instead of the seeds, along with the seed beetle and the terriers, 2 insects that will stop the seeding capacity of these plants. Things got out of hand. This little wasp, which looked like nothing when it was released, it used to stagger around in little vials and looked like it never survived a day. It hit the ground running, and galling became incredibly abundant on the trees. So much so that besides stopping seeding, the trees were stressed very much by this high level of galling. And what happens is if you go around the Western Cape today, you'll still see longifolia growing on the rivers, and the guys who are looking forward are saying, look at all this longifolia, what a problem. But if you look up the mountainsides, it's gone. The plant can't tolerate that high level of galling if it's at all water stressed, and it's disappeared from the mountain slopes. So here, if you're looking backwards up the mountain, it's a great achievement. If you just focus on what's left behind, you're going to be disappointed and say we haven't achieved anything. Next example, Acacia cyclops. Yes, this is close. This is California, Cape St. Francis, a real invader, not a Mickey Mouse about that. And again, we've got the gall fly in this case. Here's a little female laying her eggs now in the flower, the open flower, not the flower buds, and inducing these very distinctive galls to develop, each packed with several larvae, and a very prolific little insect, which has several generations a year. It builds up very rapidly, and it spreads very rapidly. It covers large distances. It got from cellulose to East London in 3 years. And again, we have a seed beetle feeding on the seeds, those as adults, as larvae, and destroying up to 70%, on average about 70% of the seed crop each year. So two very prolific agents. Now, Debbie yesterday was telling us that we don't really know what's going on. We spent a lot of time on Acacia cyclops and the other acacias measuring all sorts of parameters to try and get to understand what's happening to our agents, what's happening to the plant as the agents take effect. And I want to show you some of the results that we're getting. Before biological control, if you went into an acacia thicket, I can guarantee you would find somewhere between 2,000 and 10,000 seeds per square meter. That's the typical seed bank. Okay? There should be more, in fact, because the amount of seed being produced, if it was nothing affecting it, would have accumulated much higher. But there are other role players in the system. Prominent amongst them is the Cecidomyiidae here, the striped field mouse, which loves acacia cyclops seeds and other acacia seeds. It makes up a huge proportion of their diet, and they're removing a lot of the seeds that are falling to the ground. They even go out into the trees and get the green pods and bring them down to the ground and feed on them there. They don't like the arrow for some reason, and that's an interesting point in itself, but they certainly consume a lot of seed. The other key role player in all these acacia systems, of course, is fire, and you've seen lots of photos of fires, and that's a common thing. What happens after a fire in one of those thickets where we've got between 2,000 and 10,000 seeds is that most of those seeds are scorched, and the counts we've made show at least 98% of the seed is scorched by the fire, so it's killed, it's destroyed. That leaves a residue which is producing about 40 seedlings per square meter. So although 98% gone, that's enough to produce a whole lot of seedlings. We've measured survival rates of seedlings down to about 10%, so 90% of the seedlings die for a reason best known themselves. But that leaves 4 new plants per square meter, and that's plenty to replenish the thicket that was there before the fire, and very quickly the canopy closes again, and you're back to where you started. Very importantly though, each fire resets the clock, because 2 years after a fire, the seed that wasn't scorched is germinated, and there's no seeds left in the soil, and if you go and pour there, it's blank. Now biological control becomes the important role player. What we're seeing, and we're looking at areas where there's been fires in the last 10 years, because Dacinura has been in the system for 10 years now, you can go into those thickets, and there's no seed left in the soil still. It should have been accumulating, and it should be getting up into the hundreds, if not the thousands, by 10 years, but it's not. The soil is still blank. We're not seeing any effect. People are still seeing Acacia cyclops plentiful, and they're assuming that the insects haven't done anything. But I can guarantee you, and I'm going to propose that this plant should be put on the endangered species list, because the next fire, there's going to be no seed there to replace it. Now I'm sticking my neck out there, but I'll be very surprised if these thickets suddenly reappear when we get the next fires. The other very important thing that the agents are doing is that they're stopping long-range dispersal of the weed. So you get these vistas where these plants, it's intermeshed with famous, and moving the seeds from those plants into these open areas has practically stopped. There's no seeds to be dispersed. It's not happening. The few that are dispersed are taken up by mice very quickly. And if you look in these areas, there's no seed about there either. So that's a very important effect too. Two effects. No seeds where the thickets are, and no spread of seeds. Endangered species. Right. Just finishing off. Black wattle, we're all familiar with black wattle. And we have a cousin of the Dacinuron cyclops, which is really coming into its own right now on Acacia burnsdown. We've had the seed beetle about for quite a long time, plodding along, destroying a lot of seed, but on its own not doing enough to really bring the problem down to any manageable level. This little fly is not quite as prolific as its cousin on cyclops because it only has one generation a year, and so its build-up has been much slower. They both were released in the same 2002, and it's been a long lag phase before we're starting to see really high levels of gallings on the tree, and now we are. And here's a typical, actually it's an excellent example, but we'd say it's typical. If you look at the trees, left of this dotted dashed line, on the upper left, is this year's growth, and this is last. So the trees at the end of last year were there. Look at the pod loads there. Dacinura was on the plants, but there were just low levels of galling. This year, you cannot find a single inflorescence that hasn't been galled. There's no seed developing. And that's, as I say, that's a typical example. It is typical. That's what we're seeing. And we're measuring seed rain from these trees. It's gone down from hundreds, even up to 1,000 per square meter, to less than 1 or 2. Suddenly there's no seed left in the system. Okay. Now it's not going to happen overnight. Guernsey is going to be with us for a long time, but we can look backwards now and say, remember the good old days when we used to get zillions of seeds developing on these trees? Now there's none. Clearly something's going to change as we go along. So, what's the bottom line? Don't jump to conclusions. That website I showed you in the beginning, somebody's jumped to a conclusion without doing the right investigation. If you want to pronounce on what biocontrol is doing, make sure you understand what it's about. Don't just form an opinion and sprout it. It doesn't do anybody any good. Be patient. It's not going to happen overnight. What we're doing now isn't for us, it's for our children and grandchildren. I think they're going to benefit. And I'll just reiterate. Keep looking backwards. Ask the question, what would it have been like if we didn't have biological control? Don't say, what's it still like because we've got biocontrol? And you'll have a totally different perception of the problem. And I think that's illustrated quite nicely by this. Keep looking backwards. The guys who are looking forward aren't seeing the same things. And I'd just like to thank Fiona and Green, who currently work on these projects with me, Judy Post and Relay, who are former colleagues, they moved on to other pastures, and funding from Working for Water Director Sun Trust to UCT. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And to those of you who might be wondering who this guy is, okay, I'm Remo Magoba from Agricultural Research Council in Victoria. And we do have space for one question for Professor Hoffman.
Looking back.
Okay, there's one for you. There's one for you.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's just a compliment.
Thank you.
I think it's amazing.
Cool. Yeah, I agree. Well, the insects are the guys who, they're the heroes. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Hoffman. And I think this one